The village of St. Mary Mead had, over the years, been the scene of many peculiar incidents, but few had begun with something as seemingly trivial as a whispered warning. It was on a blustery autumn afternoon, with leaves dancing in circles along the high street, that Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer of human nature, found herself in the presence of Mrs. Letitia Blackwood, a recent widow of considerable wealth, and a woman whose face now bore the unmistakable traces of fear. The two women sat in the drawing room of Mrs. Blackwood's fine cottage, an elegant residence filled with dark wood and heavy drapes, the sort that spoke of old money and careful taste. Letitia, usually a proud and composed woman, was anything but. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, her fingers lingering over the porcelain as though distracted by some dreadful thought. "I do hope you don't think me foolish, Miss Marple," she said at last, looking up with a hesitant smile. "I find that when one is alone, one sometimes imagines things." Miss Marple, who knew better than anyone that the worries of an older woman were rarely unfounded, merely inclined her head, allowing the widow to continue. "It's just, I have this feeling, the feeling that something is terribly wrong." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled kindly. "The instincts of a woman, particularly a woman of your experience, should never be dismissed lightly, my dear." Letitia hesitated. "It's the house, the way things feel in it since Edgar passed. I could swear that someone's been in here when I'm out." Papers moved, drawers slightly ajar, and there was. She stopped herself, suddenly shaking her head. "No, that's nonsense." "Do go on," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "A week ago," Letitia said, voice lower now, "I found a note tucked into the side of my writing desk. It wasn't mine. The handwriting was unfamiliar. It simply said, 'You are in danger.'" A gust of wind rattled the window panes just then, causing Letitia to flinch slightly. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though something keen flashed in her eyes. "Have you shown this note to anyone?" she asked. Letitia shook her head. "No, I didn't want to cause a fuss." Miss Marple set her teacup down with the utmost care. "My dear, causing a fuss is quite often the most sensible thing to do when danger is afoot." Letitia gave a weak chuckle, but it quickly died away. "I don't know what to think. I know grief can do strange things to the mind, but there's something else, Miss Marple. My husband's solicitor, Mr. Weatherby, visited just 2 days before I found that note. He asked me whether I had located Edgar's final instruction, whatever that means. He seemed very certain that Edgar had left some additional papers that I was meant to find." Miss Marple, whose mind was already ticking over the possibilities, nodded thoughtfully. "And have you found any such thing?" "No," Letitia said, "not a thing. And I asked Mr. Weatherby again yesterday, but he was oddly evasive." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I fear I may be seeing ghosts where there are none, Miss Marple." Miss Marple reached over and patted the woman's hand gently. "Perhaps, and yet it never hurts to be cautious. If you should find this final instruction or anything else of concern, you must let me know at once." Letitia gave a small nod, looking slightly relieved to have spoken of it. The conversation drifted to more mundane things, but the matter of the widow's warning stayed firmly in Miss Marple's mind. It was 3 days later that Letitia Blackwood was found dead in her home. The village, as expected, keyed, buzzed with the shocking news. Mrs. Blackwood, so recently widowed, was discovered by her housekeeper, slumped in her chair in the very same drawing room where she had voiced her fears to Miss Marple. The doctor, after a cursory examination, suggested it was natural causes, perhaps a weak heart, brought on by the strain of losing her husband. But Miss Marple was not so easily convinced. She had seen the worry in Letitia's eyes. She had heard the tremor in her voice. And she knew that fear, real fear, did not spring from nothing. When she visited the Blackwood residence later that day, she was met with the usual polite reluctance of those who did not yet appreciate the value of an old lady's insights. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dobson, was in a state of distress, but she greeted Miss Marple kindly. "It's a terrible thing, madam," she said, dabbing her eyes with the edge of her apron. "Poor Mrs. Blackwood. I knew she wasn't herself lately, but I never thought she wasn't ill. Was she?" Miss Marple interjected mildly. No, that's the strange part. She was perfectly fine. Well, nervous, yes, but she kept that to herself, mostly." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And tell me, Mrs. Dobson, did she receive any visitors yesterday?" The housekeeper frowned. "Not that I saw, but then I was out for part of the afternoon, running errands in the village." Miss Marple's mind immediately supplied a troubling thought. If Mrs. Blackwood had received a visitor in that time, it would explain much. She asked to see the drawing room, and Mrs. Dobson obliged. Nothing appeared out of place at first glance, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the writing desk. It was locked, but a fine layer of dust on its surface had been disturbed as if someone had tried to open it. Mrs. Blackwood had the only key to this, I presume. "Yes," Mrs. Dobson said. She kept it with her at all times. Miss Marple's lips pursed. If someone had been searching for something, perhaps that elusive final instruction, then where was the key now? She turned and studied the chair where Letitia had been found. There was nothing remarkable about it, except for the small porcelain teacup still sitting on the side table beside it. Miss Marple picked it up, examining the inside. Just a faint trace of liquid remained, but she knew well enough that such things could be deceptive. "A cup of tea before passing," she murmured. A thought had begun to take root. A thought so dreadful that Miss Marple could not yet give voice to it. She straightened and turned to Mrs. Dobson. "Would you be so kind as to fetch me a cloth?" As the housekeeper bustled away, Miss Marple gently lifted the cup to her nose, and there it was, just the faintest hint of something bitter. Miss Marple set the cup down with great care. She already knew, deep in her heart, that this was no natural death. Mrs. Blackwood had been murdered, and Miss Marple, for all her gentle demeanor, would not rest until she found out who had done it. The news of Mrs. Blackwood's death spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of a well-tended fire. By the time Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, the village was already abuzz with speculation. At the grocer's, Mrs. Harmon, a woman with a natural talent for embroidery and embellishment, both on fabric and in storytelling, was seen whispering to Mrs. Finch. At the post office, Mr. Tompkins, a man who prided himself on knowing everything about everyone, nodded sagely, as he claimed that he had always suspected something was amiss with Mrs. Blackwood's affairs, even at the church, where solemnity was generally observed. The talk of sudden and unfortunate demise outweighed that of upcoming services. Miss Marple, however, had no need for idle gossip. She had already formed the beginnings of a theory, though it was still delicate, like the first sprout of a winter flower. What she needed now was information who might have benefited from Letitia Blackwood's death, and whether Edgar Blackwood's so-called final instruction had anything to do with it. It was for this reason that she took a stroll that very afternoon to visit Mr. Weatherby, the solicitor. The offices of Weatherby and Gray were situated in a modest brick building just off the high street, with an air of quiet efficiency about them. Inside, the walls were lined with neatly arranged legal books, their spines worn with use, and a faint smell of ink and parchment lingered in the air. Mr. Weatherby himself was a man of about 60, with thin spectacles perched on his nose, and a demeanor that suggested he had very little patience for anything outside of legal matters. When Miss Marple was shown into his office, he looked up from his paperwork with a slightly puzzled expression, as though unused to receiving visits from elderly ladies with a particular interest in murder. "Miss Marple," he said, standing politely, "what an unexpected pleasure." I assume this is in regard to the unfortunate passing of Mrs. Blackwood. Miss Marple, ever the picture of graciousness, took a seat and folded her hands primly in her lap. Indeed, Mr. Weatherby, such a tragedy. She was a dear woman, though I fear she was quite troubled in her final days. Mr. Weatherby nodded solemnly. Yes, quite. It was a shock to all of us, a sudden failure of the heart, the doctor said. Miss Marple's keen eyes did not miss the slight hesitance in his voice. Yes, she murmured, a most unfortunate tragedy. Okay, though I must say, she had mentioned something rather intriguing to me only a few days ago. Mr. Weatherby's fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Oh, she seemed most anxious about something her late husband had mentioned, the final instruction, I believe she called it. There was the briefest flicker of something behind Mr. Weatherby's eyes. He was a solicitor, trained in keeping his expressions neutral. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime reading the subtle betrayals of human nature. I had inquired about it. Yes, he said, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Blackwood was quite meticulous with his legal affairs. His will was in perfect order, naturally, but he had hinted at certain personal papers which he wished his wife to find. Unfortunately, if such documents existed, Mrs. Blackwood never located them. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. And do you think they were important? Mr. Weatherby hesitated, then sighed. Miss Marple, you are a woman of intelligence. I will not pretend that this is of no concern. Edgar Blackwood was a wealthy man, and wealthy men rarely make plans without purpose. If there was an additional instruction, it could very well have had significant implications. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing this information. If Edgar Blackwood had left behind a message, one that his wife had not yet found, it was very possible that someone else had been searching for it, and that someone might have been willing to kill for it. She left Mr. Weatherby's office with more questions than answers. But there was one thing of which she was now certain. Letitia Blackwood's death was no accident. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the home of Mrs. Amelia Redfern, a formidable widow with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind. Amelia was known for her love of bridge, her skill in managing household staff, and her absolute refusal to believe in coincidences. It was at her tea table that Miss Marple found herself in the company of several key figures in the village, all of whom had something to say about the Blackwood affair. My dear, Amelia said, pouring a particularly strong cup of tea, if you ask me, Letitia was worried about something. She had that look about her, nervous, distracted. Then, just like that, she dies. She sniffed. I don't believe in such convenient timing. Oh, but the doctor said it was natural causes, murmured Mrs. Kirby, a timid woman who always found herself seated next to Amelia and rarely dared to contradict her. Doctors see what they expect to see, Miss Marple said mildly. Amelia narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting something else, Jane? Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea. I am merely observing, dear Amelia, that if one does not look for something, one is unlikely to find it. There was a brief silence as the implication settled over the table. Well, if you ask me, said Mrs. Kirby, the whole matter is terribly suspicious. And do you know who I saw outside the Blackwood house just yesterday? Mr. Peter Lawson. Peter Lawson was Edgar Blackwood's nephew, a man in his 30s who had once been considered something of a disappointment to the family. He had a reputation for financial troubles and a certain lack of ambition that he might suddenly take an interest in his uncle's affairs was, to Miss Marple, most interesting. Oh yes, said Mrs. Kirby, nodding earnestly. I saw him near the gate, looking very serious indeed. And I heard he went to see Mr. Weatherby as well. Miss Marple's mind was already fitting this into place. If Peter Lawson had suddenly become involved, then there was certainly something at stakes, something that perhaps had been worth killing for. She set her teacup down with quiet finality. Well, my dears, she said, with a smile as gentle as it was knowing, "It seems that this little mystery is far from over." As she left Mrs. Redfern's house, the evening air was crisp and sharp with the scent of autumn. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her mind already racing ahead. Letitia Blackwood had been murdered. Of that, she had no doubt. The only question now was, who had the most to gain? The following morning dawned with a chill in the air, a sharp reminder that autumn was settling firmly over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, however, was unbothered by the weather as she wrapped her warm shawl around her shoulders and prepared for a morning walk. There was much to think about, and, as she had often found, a leisurely stroll through the village could be just as effective as hours of deep contemplation. Letitia Blackwood's death had been dismissed as natural causes, but Miss Marple was convinced otherwise. The timing was too neat, the circumstances too convenient. And then, of course, there was the matter of Edgar Blackwood's final instruction of mystery. Within the mystery, whatever he had left behind, someone had been eager to ensure that it never came to light. With these thoughts circling her mind, Miss Marple made her way toward St. Mary Mead's vicarage, a charming old building draped in ivy, its windows perpetually misted from the warmth of tea and conversation inside. The Reverend Leonard Hartnell had been vicar of St. Mary Mead for nearly a decade, a kindly but absent-minded man whose sermons often wandered off into reflections on the virtues of gardening or the evils of improper jam-making. His wife, Clarissa Hartnell, was his opposite in every way, sharp, practical, and possessed of an extraordinary memory when it came to the goings-on of the village. It was she whom Miss Marple had come to see. As expected, Clarissa received her warmly, ushering her into the sitting room, where a cozy fire crackled in the hearth. A tea tray was already set out, and Miss Marple was given the best seat near the fire, as was customary when important matters were to be discussed. "My dear Jane, I was hoping you'd call," Clarissa said as she poured out the tea. "I expect you've heard all the talk about poor Letitia." Miss Marple took a dainty sip before replying, "Oh yes, the village is positively humming with speculation. But I suspect you may have heard something particularly interesting." Clarissa's eyes twinkled with intrigue. "Well, as it happens, I did see something unusual the day before Letitia passed. You know, I always take a morning walk through the village good for the Constitution. And as I passed the Blackwood house, I noticed that the upstairs curtains twitched ever so slightly, as though someone were peering out. Naturally, I thought it was Letitia. She had been rather reclusive of late. But then, Jane, I saw her at the very same moment in the front garden, speaking with someone." Miss Marple's cup paused halfway to her lips. "How very peculiar, isn't it?" Clarissa leaned forward, and what's more, she seemed quite distressed, clutching at the person's arm. "I couldn't see clearly, but I believe it was a man." Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Letitia Blackwood had been speaking urgently with a man outside, perhaps, about the mysterious instruction Edgar had left behind, while someone else had been inside the house, watching. "And you're quite certain it was a man?" she asked. Clarissa frowned slightly, trying to recall. "I think so. He was wearing a dark coat." But now that you mention it, there was something about the way he moved that seemed cautious, as though he were afraid of being seen." That was certainly intriguing. Could it have been Peter Lawson? He had been seen near the Blackwood house around that time. Perhaps another, less obvious visitor. Clarissa stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I do hope the police have looked into all this properly. I never trust these sudden natural deaths. Too convenient by half." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "My dear, I quite agree, too." After her visit to the vicarage, Miss Marple decided to pay a call to the Blackwood house itself. With Letitia gone, the house stood quiet, its once carefully tended garden looking a little neglected. It was clear that no one had taken much care since her passing. She was about to turn away when the front door opened, and to her surprise, Peter Lawson stepped out onto the doorstep. He froze for a moment upon seeing her, then quickly composed himself. "Miss Marple," he said with a polite nod. "Mr. Lawson," she replied warmly. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Peter hesitated, then gave a slight shrug. I had some matters to attend to. Family affairs?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Of course, quite understandable. I imagine there must be a great deal to settle." Peter cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, my aunt's passing was unexpected." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone light but pointed. "A sudden loss is always difficult, especially when one is left with unanswered questions." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Peter's face, and perhaps even guilt, but he quickly masked it. "Yes, well, if you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have an appointment." She watched as he strode away, his steps brisk but not quite steady. A man with something on his conscience. Miss Marple stood for a moment, considering. There was no doubt. Now Letitia Blackwood's death was no accident. The only question was, how long could the murderer keep their secrets hidden? Miss Marple spent the afternoon reflecting on her conversation with Clarissa Hartnell and her brief but telling encounter with Peter Lawson. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Letitia Blackwood's death had not been a natural one. So were too many questions, too many loose ends, and the way Peter had reacted to her casual probing had been most revealing at times like these. Miss Marple believed in taking a step back and allowing events to unfold naturally. People revealed themselves when they thought no one was watching, and secrets had a way of rising to the surface. With this in mind, she decided on a quiet evening of knitting and observation at the village's most reliable source of information, Rose and Crown. The local inn and pub was a hub of village life, where farmers, shopkeepers, and household staff alike gathered to exchange news over a pint. If there were whispers to be heard about Letitia Blackwood's sudden demise, this would be the place to hear them. She settled herself at a small table near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking gently as she listened to the hum of conversation. At the bar, the landlord, Mr. Weatherby, was deep in discussion with Dr. Jeremy Howard, a young physician who had declared Letitia's death as natural causes. "Still say it was heart failure," Dr. Howard was saying, shaking his head. "The poor woman wasn't in the best of health." "That may be so," Mr. Weatherby said gruffly, polishing a glass. "But there's been talk, doctor. Some folks think it was all a bit sudden, if you know what I mean." Dr. Howard sighed. "Everyone in this village sees murder behind every doorstep creak." Letitia Blackwood was an elderly woman with a history of ailments. There was nothing unnatural about it. Miss Marple carefully placed a neat row of stitches before looking up. "Oh, but doctor," she said sweetly, "isn't it true that poison can mimic heart failure in certain cases?" "Okay." The doctor looked startled by the question. "Poison?" He laughed, though it sounded forced. "Miss Marple, you've been reading too many detective novels." Miss Marple smiled demurely. "Oh no, dear. I have read quite a number of case studies over the years. I recall one rather fascinating instance where a certain substance caused a person to grow terribly weak, for their heart simply gave out. The trouble, of course, is that it dissolves so quickly in the body that it's often mistaken for natural causes." Dr. Howard's expression darkened. "I assure you, Miss Marple, there was no sign of poison. And even if there were, why on earth would anyone wish to harm poor Letitia Blackwood?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "That is the question, isn't it?" The doctor muttered something about village gossip before finishing his drink and excusing himself. Mr. Weatherby watched him go before leaning over the bar toward Miss Marple. "You're not the only one with suspicions, Miss Marple," he said in a low voice. "It's been talk." She looked up at him with polite interest. And what sort of talk? Mr. Weatherby glanced around, then lowered his voice even further. Mrs. Blackwood had a visitor the night before she died. Command. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her knitting. Are you certain? He nodded. Tom Rigsby, the stable boy, saw him leaving just after dusk. Said he was wrapped up in a heavy coat, but he walked like he was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. Miss Marple considered this carefully. It was consistent with Clarissa's account of a mysterious man speaking urgently with Letitia in the garden. But who was he? Before she could ask further, the inn door swung open, and in walked a tall woman in a fitted navy coat, her auburn hair swept back in an elegant chignon. Eleanor Blackwood, Peter's sister and Letitia's niece. She spotted Miss Marple immediately and crossed the room with the air of someone who was not accustomed to waiting for an invitation. Miss Marple, he said briskly, sitting opposite her without preamble. I believe we should have a word. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. Of course, my dear. What's on your mind? Eleanor's gaze was sharp. You've been asking questions about my aunt's death. Miss Marple smiled. In a village like ours, one does hear things. And I confess, I do find the whole matter rather unusual. Eleanor sighed, drumming her fingers on the table. I won't pretend I was particularly close to Aunt Letitia, okay? But she was family, and I don't appreciate the implication that Peter or I had anything to do with our passing. Miss Marple noted the slight defensiveness in her tone. Oh, I would never make such an accusation, my dear. But I do wonder, did your aunt mention anything to you about her late husband's instructions? Eleanor's expression tightened ever so slightly. Okay, she said after a pause. And if she had, I doubt it would have been anything of consequence. Miss Marple tilted her head. She seemed quite anxious about it in her final days. One wonders why. Eleanor stood abruptly. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have a great deal to attend to. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind worry. Eleanor Blackwood was hiding something. But was it merely family pride, or was there something far more sinister at play? One thing was certain, Letitia Blackwood had not gone to her grave in peace, and Miss Marple intended to find out why. The next morning dawned crisp and cool, with the faintest touch of frost on the hedgerows. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, had already finished her tea and was making her way through the village when she spotted young Tom Rigsby, the stable boy from the Rose and Crown. He was leaning against the fence outside the Blackwood estate, kicking at the dirt with the scuffed toe of his boot. Sensing an opportunity, Miss Marple approached him with a friendly smile. Good morning, Tom. Out, enjoying the fresh air. Tom looked up, startled. He was a lad of about 16, lanky and awkward, with a smattering of freckles across his nose. Oh, morning, Miss Marple. She tilted her head slightly. I heard from Mr. Weatherby that you happened to see a visitor at the Blackwood house the night before. Mrs. Blackwood passed away. The boy shuffled uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the wooden fence. I suppose I did. Miss Marple's expression remained kindly. Would you mind telling me exactly what you saw? Would help an old lady satisfy her curiosity. Tom hesitated, then sighed. It was getting dark, but I was out in the stable. See? I'd just finished brushing down old Clover when I saw this fella coming up the side gate. The side gate, Miss Marple repeated, thoughtfully. Not the front door. Tom shook his head. No, ma'am. Looked like he didn't want nobody seeing him. He was bundled up in a heavy coat, but I could tell he weren't one of the usual village folk. Walked different, like he was used to fancier places. And he was muttering to himself, all nervous-like. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. And did you see where he went? The boy scratched his head. Not rightly. He went off down the lane toward the woods, but I didn't follow. Figured it weren't my business. Miss Marple considered this. It's a man unfamiliar to the village. visiting Letitia Blackwood in secret the night before her death. It was a significant detail. She patted Tom's arm gently. "Thank you, dear boy. You've been very helpful." Tom looked relieved to be dismissed and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. As she turned to continue her walk, she caught sight of Peter Lawson emerging from the Blackwood house. He looked tired, his usually impeccable suit slightly wrinkled. The sight of Miss Marple seemed to make him hesitate, but then he forced a smile and strode toward her. "Miss Marple," he greeted her politely. "Taking your morning constitutional?" She smiled pleasantly. "Indeed, a little fresh air and exercise do wonders for the mind." She paused before adding, "I do hope all is well with you, Mr. Lawson. You seem rather preoccupied." Peter ran a hand through his dark hair. "It's just everything, really. The house, the estate, my aunt's affairs. It's a great deal to handle all at once." Miss Marple observed him keenly. "I imagine sorting through Mrs. Blackwood's papers must be quite a task." His mouth tightened slightly. She was rather meticulous about her records, but there are still loose ends to tie up." Miss Marple hesitated, then decided to take a direct approach. "I wonder, Mr. Lawson, your aunt ever mentioned anything about her late husband's instructions regarding the estate?" Peter's eyes narrowed just a fraction before he forced a laugh. "I see you've been speaking with Clarissa Hartnell." It seemed quite convinced that Mrs. Blackwood was troubled about something in the days before her passing, Miss Marple said mildly. "And now I hear that she had a visitor the night before she died. It does make one wonder." Peter stiffened. "A visitor?" Miss Marple nodded. "A man seen leaving by the side gate after dark." "I don't suppose you know anything about that." Kate's expression flickered. Was it surprise or something else? Then he shook his head. "No, my aunt didn't mention expecting anyone. Perhaps it was just a solicitor or an old acquaintance." Miss Marple simply smiled. "Perhaps." Peter's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if trying to gauge how much she truly knew. Then he exhaled sharply. "Miss Marple, I know there's a great deal of speculation in the village, but my aunt was an elderly woman. She had health issues. I don't want rumors making this harder than it already is." She met his gaze steadily. "Of course, no one would wish to make things harder for you, Mr. Lawson, but you must admit some deaths do leave unanswered questions." Akita didn't reply. Instead, he nodded briefly and strode away. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind working swiftly. Peter was hiding something. Whether it was merely about his aunt's will or something far darker remained to be seen. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Jeremy Howard's surgery. The young physician looked mildly exasperated to see her. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a seat, "I assume you're here to ask more questions about Mrs. Blackwood." She smiled. "You're very perceptive, doctor. I was just wondering. You examined her. Did you find anything unusual?" Dr. Howard sighed. "As I told you before, I saw no evidence of foul play." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "But humor me, dear boy. Did she complain of any discomfort before her death? Dizziness? Nausea?" The doctor hesitated, then rubbed his chin. "Well, now that you mention it, Eleanor Blackwood did say something about her aunt feeling unwell that evening. But again, at her age, it wasn't unusual." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already racing. Letitia had been feeling ill before her death. Could it have been something administered to her? Something designed to mimic natural causes? She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Doctor, if someone had wanted to hasten Mrs. Blackwood's passing, what might they have used?" Dr. Howard blinked at her. "Miss Marple, I really don't." He stopped, frowning. Then, after a pause, he said, "Well, there are certain substances that could induce a fatal episode digitalis. For instance, if taken in excess, can cause heart failure, but such things wouldn't be easily available." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "Not easily available, perhaps, but to someone with access to an apothecary, to a doctor's supplies." That was another matter entirely. As she left the doctor's office, her mind whirled with possibilities. A mysterious visitor, a troubled woman, a sudden death, and a family that seemed all too eager to dismiss any suspicions. Something was very wrong in the Blackwood household, and Miss Marple intended to find out exactly what it was. The crisp autumn air carried a sharpness as Miss Marple strolled through St. Mary Mead, her thoughts churning over the details of the case. The village, outwardly peaceful, concealed a growing tension beneath its surface. Letitia Blackwood's sudden passing had unsettled many, but no one more than Miss Marple, who had long ago learned to trust her instincts when things did not add up. She was convinced now that Letitia had been afraid of something or someone, and that fear had not been unfounded. The discovery of a mysterious visitor, the unease surrounding Peter Lawson, and the doctor's subtle hints of an unnatural end all painted a picture more troubling than she had first suspected. Her first stop that morning was the vicarage, where Clarissa Hartnell had invited her for tea. As Miss Marple stepped inside, she was greeted by the warmth of a roaring fire and the scent of freshly brewed Darjeeling. Clarissa, always the picture of genteel composure, poured the tea with steady hands. "My dear Jane, you do look as if you have something pressing on your mind," Clarissa observed as she passed a delicate china cup to Miss Marple. "I take it you've been asking questions." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea before replying. "It is the most curious thing, Clarissa. So many little pieces that do not quite fit together. But I have been wondering about something you said to me the other day about Mrs. Blackwood, seeming troubled before she passed. Do you recall anything else she might have said? Anything at all?" Clarissa furrowed her brow, clearly searching her memory. "She was restless, that much I remember. There was something about her husband's will that troubled her, and I do recall her saying, 'It isn't what I thought it was. I must put things right.'" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Put things right." Clarissa nodded. "Yes, at the time, I assumed she was speaking about some arrangement for Peter. But now, I do wonder." Miss Marple set her cup down with a soft clink. "Clarissa, did she say whether she had spoken to anyone about these concerns?" Clarissa hesitated. "Not directly, but she did say she was waiting for a letter, something important." A letter. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Had this letter arrived, or had it been intercepted? Before she could ask further, there was a knock at the door. Clarissa excused herself to answer it, and to Miss Marple's mild surprise, in stepped Eleanor Blackwood. The young widow looked pale and drawn, her dark eyes wary as they settled on Miss Marple. "I didn't expect to find you here," Eleanor said hesitantly. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "A happy coincidence, my dear." Eleanor pressed her lips together before turning to Clarissa. "I wanted to speak with you privately." Miss Marple made a motion to rise. "Oh, of course," but Eleanor quickly shook her head. "No, please, stay. In fact, I think you might be the very person I need to talk to." Clarissa and Miss Marple exchanged a glance before Clarissa gestured for Eleanor to sit. The younger woman perched on the edge of the chair, her hands ringing in her lap. "I don't know why I feel this way, but I cannot shake the thought that something is terribly wrong," Eleanor confessed. "At first, I tried to dismiss it, but the more I think about it, the more I am convinced Letitia did not die naturally." Miss Marple inclined her head. "What has led you to believe that, my dear?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "It's the little things. The way she looked the evening before, agitated, nervous. And then there was the medicine." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Medicine?" Eleanor nodded. "Keisha had a tonic she took every evening. She never forgot it. It was kept in a blue bottle on her dressing table. But when I went to look for it after she died, it was missing." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the arm of her chair. "Missing?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. asked Peter about it, but he said he hadn't seen it. And when I mentioned it to Dr. Howard, he seemed troubled, but didn't say much. I didn't know who else to turn to. Miss Marple took a deep breath. A missing medicine bottle. A woman convinced something was amiss. Visitor who had slipped away unseen. It was all beginning to make a dreadful sort of sense. She patted Eleanor's hand reassuringly. You have done the right thing in speaking up, my dear. Eleanor exhaled shakily. What do I do now? Miss Marple's expression was gentle but firm. You leave that to me. That evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to Dr. Howard. He looked surprised to see her again so soon. Miss Marple, he said warily, this is becoming a habit. She gave him a small smile. I do apologize, dear boy, but I have learned something rather troubling. Eleanor Blackwood has informed me that her late aunt's medicine bottle is missing. Dr. Howard's face darkened. He closed the door behind her and gestured toward his desk. Sit. Miss Marple complied, watching him carefully. I didn't want to say anything without proof, Dr. Howard said after a pause. But now that you mention it, I did have concerns. Like Sam and Mrs. Blackwood, I found something at traces of a substance that suggested digitalis poisoning. Miss Marple's heartbeat quickened. Digitalis. Yes, is derived from foxglove, and in controlled doses. It's used to treat heart conditions, but in overdoses, especially in an elderly woman, would be fatal. I didn't push for an inquiry because there was no evidence of how she might have ingested it. But now, if her medicine bottle was tampered with or is missing, Miss Marple's expression turned grave. Then we may well be dealing with murder. Dr. Howard exhaled sharply. Miss Marple, if you're right, whoever did this is still out there. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Lee, and they have gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. She rose to her feet, her sharp blue eyes gleaming with quiet determination, but not for long. A hush had fallen over St. Mary Mead. The village, usually alive with the sounds of daily life, of gossip exchanged at the grocer's, of children laughing by the green, seemed subdued, as though it too had sensed the darkness lurking beneath its surface. Miss Marple, for all her years of experience in reading human nature, knew that fear had begun to settle in. Letitia Blackwood's death was no longer a quiet tragedy. It was now a puzzle that left everyone wondering who among them might be a murderer. She sat in her cottage that evening, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, though her mind was far removed from the pattern she was working on. Digitalis, poisoning, a missing medicine bottle, a widow growing increasingly fearful. It was all aligning into something tangible, though one crucial piece remained missing. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Rising, she opened it to find Inspector Morton standing on her doorstep, his expression grim. Miss Marple, I believe you and I need to have a serious talk. She invited him in, offering tea, which he politely declined. He remained standing, as though too restless to sit. I've just come from speaking with Dr. Howard, he said, rubbing a hand over his chin. Tells me you're of the opinion that Letitia Blackwood was murdered. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. Not merely an opinion, Inspector. A strong suspicion. Though, of course, one must always have proof. Morton sighed. And do you have any? Not quite yet, she admitted. But I do have questions that need answering. Morton regarded her carefully, such as, she smiled slightly. For instance, who had the opportunity to tamper with her medicine? And if someone did so, what exactly was their motive? Mrs. Blackwood was a wealthy woman, was she not? She was, Morton agreed. But her estate was entailed. Most of her assets would have gone to Peter Lawson, her nephew. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. And what of Eleanor Blackwood, the widow? Morton's lips pressed together. She was provided for, but modestly, enough to live comfortably, nothing more. Miss Marple thought for a moment before asking, And has Peter Lawson been behaving rather oddly of late? Morton exhaled sharply. You could say that. Key's been avoiding me, for one. I intended to speak with him today, but he was nowhere to be found. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Missing? Morton nodded. His housekeeper said he left early this morning and hasn't returned. His car is still there, so he's on foot. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against her chair. Curious, Morton studied her intently. You suspect him, don't you? I suspect many people, Inspector, she said gently. But the truth has a way of making itself known. Morton let out a short laugh. Well, I'd appreciate it if it did so before someone else turns up dead. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. Quiet, unspoken concern. Because if Peter Lawson was missing, there were two possibilities. He had fled because he was guilty, or he had become the next target. She did not like either option. The next morning, Miss Marple set out early. There was someone she wished to see. As she walked through the village, she noticed how people watched her from behind lace curtains. Their curiosity piqued. Word traveled fast in St. Mary Mead, and the scent of scandal was an irresistible lure. Her destination was Eleanor Blackwood's cottage. The young widow answered the door quickly, her eyes tired, as though she had not slept. Miss Marple, she said in surprise. I wasn't expecting. I hope I'm not intruding, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly, but I wondered if I might have a word. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding and stepping aside. The sitting room was small but tidy, with fresh flowers in a vase on the table, a habit, Miss Marple imagined, carried over from her life before Letitia's death. I suppose you've come about Peter? Eleanor said after a pause. Miss Marple studied her carefully. So, you've heard? Eleanor nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Everyone has. It's all over the village. Miss Marple set her bag down. And what do you think of it, my dear? Eleanor hesitated. I don't know what to think. Peter and I were never particularly close, but he wasn't a bad person, though I know he and Aunt Letitia had disagreements. Disagreements. Eleanor looked uncomfortable. Over the will, mostly. He always assumed he would inherit everything outright. But Aunt Letitia changed things at the last minute. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Changed things. Eleanor nodded. Yes, she made sure I had a place to live, but there was something else. A portion of her estate was to be set aside for someone. But I don't know who. Miss Marple's mind was racing. Letitia Blackwood had tried to set things right. Was this what she had meant? Eleanor, she said softly, do you know if a letter arrived for your aunt before she died? Eleanor frowned. I know. I don't think so. But wait. She hesitated. There was an envelope on her writing desk the night before she died. I remember because she seemed so agitated about it. But when I looked for it later, it was gone. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A missing letter. A missing bottle. And now, a missing man. Before she could respond, there was a loud, insistent knock at the door. Eleanor jumped, her face paling. Who could that be? She whispered. Miss Marple motioned for her to remain seated as she went to open the door. Standing on the doorstep was a young constable, his face flushed from running. Miss Marple, he panted. Inspector Morton sent me. There's been a discovery. Miss Marple's heart clenched. A discovery. The constable nodded, swallowing hard. It's Peter Lawson. We found him. Eleanor gasped behind. Miss Marple's voice was calm, steady, though her mind raced with possibilities. And is he alive? The constable hesitated just a fraction too long. No, Miss Marple, he's dead. A heavy silence filled the room. Eleanor clutched the back of a chair for support, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Miss Marple, however, merely nodded, her expression unreadable. Then, a dear boy, she said, smoothing down her skirt. I suppose It is time to uncover the truth. The village of St. Mary Mead was a place where life moved at a predictable rhythm until a murder, or in this case, two, shattered that illusion. The discovery of Peter Lawson's lifeless body had set off another wave of fear. Whispers filled the air, and people cast uneasy glances at one another, wondering if a killer still moved among them. Miss Marple, however, did not waste time on speculation. She understood something essential about human nature. In times of fear, people revealed more than they intended, and it was in these moments that the truth could be coaxed from its hiding place. As she arrived at the crime scene, Inspector Morton was already there, his expression grim. The body had been found at the edge of a wooded path, not far from Letitia Blackwood's home. The morning mist curled around the trees, lending an eerie stillness to the scene. "Miss Marple," Morton said, acknowledging her presence. His tone was laced with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant admiration. "I suppose it's useless to tell you to stay away." Miss Marple gave him a polite smile. "Oh, but I believe I might be of some assistance, Inspector." Morton sighed and gestured toward the ground. He was struck on the head, blunt force. Trauma. No sign of a struggle. Whatever happened, it was swift. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took into details. Peter Lawson's coat was slightly askew, and one of his shoes had a scuffed mark along the side. High, but it was the position of his hands that intrigued her. One was curled slightly inward, as though he had been holding something when he fell. "His fingers," she murmured. "Do you see, Inspector? Okay. It looks as though he grasped something in his final moments." Morton frowned, kneeling beside the body. "You're right." He reached forward carefully, prying open the stiffening hand. A piece of fabric, dark and torn, lay within Peter's grasp. "A clue," Miss Marple said softly. Morton examined it closely. "It looks like part of a sleeve, perhaps from the person who killed him." He glanced up at her. "I assume you already have a theory." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "I have a feeling the answer has been in front of us all along." As they returned to the village, Miss Marple felt the weight of understanding settle upon her. It was time to speak with Eleanor Blackwood. Eleanor's hands trembled as she poured tea for Miss Marple. It was late afternoon, and the light in her sitting room was growing dim. She had been in a state of shock since hearing about Peter's death. But Miss Marple suspected there was something more, burden she had yet to share. "I suppose you think I had something to do with it," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice hollow. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "I think, my dear, that you have been keeping secrets, and secrets, when left too long, have a way of becoming quite dangerous." Eleanor set the teapot down with a sharp clink. "I didn't kill Peter," she whispered. But I knew something was wrong." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing the confession to unfold naturally. "I overheard Peter arguing with someone the night before he disappeared." Eleanor continued. "I couldn't make out everything, but he sounded desperate." She swallowed hard. "I think he knew something about Aunt Letitia's death, and I think he was trying to use it to his advantage." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Who was he speaking with?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I have a suspicion." Miss Marple waited. "It might have been Dr. Howard." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Dr. Howard?" Eleanor nodded. "He was close to Aunt Letitia, and I noticed he started acting differently after her death." It was an intriguing thought, but Miss Marple was not yet convinced. She knew how easy it was to suspect those who were closest to the deceased. However, she also knew that doctors had access to medicine like digitalis. "I think it's time we paid the good doctor a visit," she said. Dr. Howard greeted them stiffly, his usual composure slightly strained. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Miss Marple?" he asked, motioning for them to sit. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I was hoping you might answer a few questions about Letitia Blackwood. Dr. Howard's expression did not change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something guarded. I've already told the police everything I know. Miss Marple smiled gently. Okay. Oh, I'm sure you have. But you see, there's something that has been troubling me. Mrs. Blackwood's medicine bottle, her digitalis, went missing. Now, who would have had access to it? Dr. Howard's jaw tightened. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Not at all, she said sweetly. I am merely considering possibilities. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably beside her. Dr. Howard, I overheard Peter talking to someone the night before he disappeared. I think it was you. Dr. Howard's face darkened. That's absurd. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Key, you were very fond of Letitia, were you not? Howard exhaled sharply. She was a good woman, a strong woman. Yes, I cared for her. You were aware that she was changing her will. A silence stretched between them. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Finally, Miss Marple sighed. Oh, but I believe you do. And I believe Peter Lawson also knew something. He confronted you about it, didn't he? Dr. Howard's face was pale now. I didn't kill him. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and withdrew the torn piece of fabric that had been found in Peter's hand. She held it up. Would you care to explain why this matches the jacket you're wearing? Eleanor gasped softly. Dr. Howard's mouth opened, then closed. He looked as though he might argue, but then, as if all the fight had drained from him, he sagged into his chair. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Miss Marple remained quiet, waiting for the truth. I loved Letitia, but she was planning to leave a large portion of her estate to someone else, someone she wouldn't tell me about. His hands clenched. Peter found out. He was going to blackmail me. Said he had proof. Eleanor whispered, so you killed him. Dr. Howard's voice was filled with regret. I didn't mean to. I met him that night to try and reason with him, but he laughed at me, called me a fool. He swallowed. I lost my temper. Silence hung in the air. Miss Marple, her voice soft but firm, said, and Letitia, did you kill her too? Dr. Howard's face twisted with anguish. No, he said. No, I swear I didn't. Miss Marple believed him. There was still another piece of this puzzle left unsolved, and she intended to solve it. The air in Dr. Howard's sitting room had turned thick with the weight of his confession. Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, while Miss Marple remained composed, her sharp blue eyes studying the broken man before her. It admitted to killing Peter Lawson in a fit of rage, but there was one question still lingering in the air. Had he also murdered Letitia Blackwood? Dr. Howard's hands shook as he rubbed his temples. I didn't kill Letitia, he murmured. I loved her. Why would I do such a thing? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Love, my dear Dr. Howard, is a curious thing. It can inspire acts of great kindness or acts of great cruelty. And yet, I do not think you are lying. Not entirely. Eleanor exhaled sharply, as if she had been holding her breath. But if you didn't kill Aunt Letitia, then who did? The doctor looked up at them, his eyes dark with exhaustion. I wish I knew. Miss Marple's mind was already working at full speed. She had suspected Dr. Howard of being involved, but his emotions seemed genuine. He had killed Peter Lawson, yes, but Letitia's death was another matter. The truth, she knew, was still buried beneath layers of deceit and secrecy. She stood slowly, her gaze falling on the doctor's desk. A row of medical books lined one shelf, their spines neat and undisturbed. A few papers were scattered across the surface, but something caught her eye. A letter, half folded, with a familiar-looking seal pressed into the paper. Without a word, she picked it up and read the first few lines. Her lips pursed ever so slightly. Dr. Howard noticed her expression and stiffened. "What is it?" Miss Marple turned the letter toward him. A letter from Letitia, dated just a few days before her death. In it, she mentions an unfortunate disagreement she had with someone close to her. Eleanor leaned forward. "Who did she say?" Miss Marple's finger traced the lines of the letter. "I cannot help but feel that my decision has made someone terribly angry," she read aloud. "I fear I may have misjudged their intentions. If something should happen to me, I only hope the truth will come to light." A shiver ran through Eleanor. She knew someone wanted to harm her. Miss Marple set the letter down carefully. "Yes, my dear, I believe she did. The question is who?" Dr. Howard's voice was barely above a whisper. "If I didn't kill her, then the real murderer is still out there." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I dare say they are growing nervous. You see, murderers have a peculiar way of betraying themselves in the end, okay? They begin to feel the walls closing in, and when that happens, they make mistakes." She turned to Eleanor. "My dear, I think it is time we paid a visit to your Aunt Letitia's solicitor." The office of Mr. Archibald Greaves was a small but respectable establishment in the heart of St. Mary Mead. The elderly solicitor greeted them with a polite, if slightly distracted manner, his round spectacles perched on the edge of his nose. "Miss Marple, Miss Blackwood," he said, gesturing for them to sit. "To what do I owe this visit?" Miss Marple wasted no time. "Mr. Greaves, I believe you are in charge of drawing up Letitia Blackwood's will." The solicitor hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, indeed." She made several adjustments to it shortly before her passing. Eleanor's eyes widened. "Adjustments?" Mr. Greaves sighed, folding his hands together. "Your aunt had a change of heart regarding her inheritance. She originally intended to leave the majority of her estate to you, Miss Blackwood. However, a few weeks before her death, she made a rather surprising amendment." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she felt the pieces shifting into place. "And who was named in the amendment?" Mr. Greaves hesitated again. "Distant relative. A certain Mr. Henry Blackwood." Eleanor's breath caught. "Henry?" Miss Marple gave her a curious glance. "You know him?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "He's a cousin, though I barely know him. He lives abroad, in South America, I believe. We haven't seen him in years." Mr. Greaves cleared his throat. "Well, he was set to inherit a rather significant portion of the estate. Miss Blackwood was quite insistent upon it." Miss Marple's mind raced. Why would Letitia suddenly decide to leave her fortune to a distant cousin rather than her beloved niece? And more importantly, had someone else known about this decision? "Tell me, Mr. Greaves," she asked gently, "who else was aware of this change in the will?" The solicitor's brow furrowed. "Only myself, Letitia. And, of course, the witness who signed it." Eleanor sat up straighter. "Who was the witness?" Mr. Greaves glanced at his records before answering. "Miss Adelaide Carter." A cold wave swept over Miss Marple. Adelaide Carter, the housekeeper. She turned to Eleanor, her voice soft but urgent. "My dear, I believe we must return to Blackwood Manor at once." The house was dark when they arrived, the looming shape of Blackwood Manor standing silent against the night. As they stepped inside, the air was thick with something unseen a presence, a tension hanging in the shadows. Miss Marple moved carefully, her senses on high alert. She had a feeling that the final act of this mystery was about to unfold. As they reached the drawing room, a creaking sound made Eleanor freeze. Then, a voice. "I wondered when you would come." From the shadows, Adelaide Carter stepped forward, her face calm to calm. In her hand, she held a small vial. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "You knew, didn't you, Miss Carter? You knew about the will?" The housekeeper's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Of course, I knew. I was there when she signed it." Eleanor's voice trembled. You poisoned her. Adelaide tilted her head slightly. She never should have changed the will. I been her most loyal servant for years, and yet she was willing to throw it all away for a man who didn't even care for her. Miss Marple took a small step forward. Can Peter Lawson? Did he find out? Adelaide's eyes darkened. Okay, he was snooping where he shouldn't have been. He found the old will. He knew something was amiss. Her grip on the vial tightened. I couldn't let him talk. Eleanor gasped. You killed him too. Miss Marple's eyes never left the housekeeper. Okay now, Miss Carter, what do you intend to do next? The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. Then a loud knock at the door. Inspector Morton's voice rang out. Miss Carter, I suggest you open the door. For the first time, Adelaide Carter's composure cracked. As she looked between them, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. God. Then, with a sharp breath, she dropped the vial onto the floor, where it shattered into a million tiny pieces. Miss Marple exhaled, a quiet triumph in her eyes. And so, she murmured, the puzzle is complete. A moment of silence followed the sharp sound of the vial shattering against the floor. The liquid within seeped into the cracks of the wooden planks, an unspoken testament to the poison that had already claimed 2 lives. Adelaide Carter stood, frozen, her face a mask of composed defiance, but her hands trembled at her sides. The heavy thud of Inspector Morton's boots in the hallway shattered the tension as he strode into the room, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Well, now, he said, his eyes narrowing at the housekeeper. It seems we have arrived just in time. Miss Marple turned to him, her expression serene, though her sharp gaze flickered over every minute detail of Adelaide's face. Yes, Inspector, I believe you have. Miss Carter was just about to enlighten us on her rather unique perspective on justice. Adelaide exhaled sharply through her nose, her shoulders rising and falling with a barely contained fury. Justice, Skew spat, her voice tight with emotion. What do you know of justice, Miss Marple? You sit in your little cottage, knitting and listening to the village gossip. But you don't know what it's like to devote your life to someone only to be cast aside like an old rag. Miss Marple regarded her with an almost grandmotherly patience. Oh, but I do, my dear. Women of my generation understand all too well the quiet sacrifices made in service to others. Her expression grew firmer. But that does not justify murder. Adelaide's breath came faster now. She promised me security, a future. I gave her everything years of my life. And then, suddenly, she decides to change her will, to leave it all to Henry Blackwood, a man who hadn't set foot in England for a decade. Lena's voice was barely a whisper. You killed her for money. Adelaide's eyes snapped to her. Kid to her, because she betrayed me, she hissed. She had no right. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly, and Peter Lawson. Blade's lips pressed into a thin line. He was an idiot, snooping about where he didn't belong. I thought perhaps he had found out about the poisoning. I couldn't risk it. Inspector Morton's voice was clipped and businesslike. And so you silenced him as well. Adelaide's composure cracked just slightly, the edges fraying like an unraveling thread. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with the kind of dignity one might expect from a woman of her station. I did what I had to do. Miss Marple gave a small sigh, shaking her head. But you see, my dear Miss Carter, the thing about murder is it never quite works out as neatly as one intends. One crime begets another. One lie demands a dozen more. And in the end, it is not justice you serve, but your own ruin. The housekeeper's fingers twitched, as if she might lunge, but then the weight of the moment seemed to crush her all at once. Her knees buckled slightly, and for the first time that evening, she looked afraid. Inspector Morton gestured to his men, take her away. As they stepped forward, Adelaide's final mask slipped. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Tet, you're all fools, she muttered. as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Do you think Henry Blackwood deserves any of it? You think Letitia was some kind of saint? She was just as selfish as the rest of us. The only difference is, I had the courage to act. She turned her gaze on Miss Marple, something unreadable in her eyes. You think you've won, don't you? Miss Marple met her gaze with quiet certainty. No one wins in murder, Miss Carter. There are only survivors. The housekeeper was led from the room, her footsteps dragging against the polished wooden floors. A strange, empty silence followed in her wake. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It's over, she murmured. Miss Marple gave her a thoughtful look. Yes, my dear. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, how much of it was ever really about money? Or was it something far older, resentment, bitterness, a lifetime of small wounds festering in the dark? She sighed. Well, human nature is a tangled thing. Eleanor shivered. And to think she was right there in the house with us this whole time. If she hadn't been caught. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. She was, my dear. You see, that is the thing about Evelette, believes itself to be clever, but it always underestimates those who simply pay attention. The next morning, the village was already buzzing with talk. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bellwether was explaining, in vivid detail, how she had always thought Adelaide Carter had a mean look about her. At the post office, Mr. Peters was nodding sagely, declaring that he had suspected the housekeeper from the beginning. Miss Marple, for her part, sat quietly by her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. She had seen it all before, how quickly people distanced themselves from tragedy once it had passed, how a crime that had shaken an entire household could, in time, become nothing more than an afternoon's gossip. Eleanor arrived just before tea, taking a seat beside her. Aunt Letitia's solicitor says the estate will take some time to settle, but it looks as though I will be able to keep the house after all. Miss Marple smiled gently. That is good news, my dear, and I do believe Blackwood Manor could use a bit of light after all the darkness. Eleanor hesitated, then said softly, I can't stop thinking about what Adelaide said, about how Aunt Letitia betrayed her. Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting. It is a sad thing, my dear, when bitterness consumes a person. It starts small, like a drop of ink in a glass of water, but before long, it taints everything. She paused, then added, but remember, this anger may lead to murder. But it is greed, pride, and fear that make people justify it. Eleanor nodded slowly, and yet she thought she had one. Marple sighed. They always do, my dear. Right up until the moment they don't. A breeze stirred the garden, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the scent of late summer blooms. The world moved on, as it always did, but Miss Marple knew that there were always more mysteries to unravel, more hidden truths waiting in the corners of quiet villages. She picked up her tea, took a sip, and allowed herself a small, knowing smile.